try to turn to the core thing which you've asked me to talk about, which is the crisis of democracy in an elected dictatorship. Now, there is a crisis of democracy here in Britain, and I don't need to share with you all of the issues which are going wrong, but I just wanted to sort of talk with one of them, and that is the water companies, because it seems to me that they are more than symbolic of what is happening here and what is happening to our country. Here we have these privatized companies who are literally pouring shit into our rivers and into our coastal and beach areas and our sea. And they are pumping against the law toxic materials and into our own water system, while taking profits, enormous profits abroad, and also overcharging us. And this has now been going on for years. And you have to ask yourself, what kind of government would allow this? What kind of opposition to the government would not address this issue? And this is where the point that Ben makes about consent is really important to take on board. The British government, although deeply undemocratic in many respects, has been based upon the organization of consent, going back now for at least 2 centuries. Sometimes that's been orchestrated through war, but it's also been orchestrated through an attempt to deliver relatively good public policies. And consent was achieved, for example, by the female part, by women, long before they had the vote. Most women who were political, middle class, large numbers of middle class women, certainly felt a powerful allegiance to the state. So consent preceded the vote. The vote was only granted, for example, on a very large scale after the First World War, once that consent had been demonstrated and the ruling class felt confident and safe enough to actually hand voting rights over to the public. But they were always went out of their way to seek to organize consent. And the electoral system that we have is one of being able to change government peacefully without dictatorship, is itself part of an attempt to ensure that those who are out of power consent to the exercise of power because they have a feeling that there's at one point or another within the system, they are capable of gaining entrance back into it, that we don't live under a dictatorship. Now, a government that believes in that consent would never allow its rivers and beaches to be poisoned. So we're now in a situation where we are governed by an administration, including not just the political party, but also the civil service, which no longer cares about what we feel about our rivers and our beaches. There is a way in which the ruling administrative elite have their commitment to ensuring fundamental consent has been broken. And that's a very, very deep issue. And Ben is quite right to say that when that happens, the system starts to collapse. And we are in this process, I can say, but go deep of collapse. So if you look at the second issue that is in the title of what you've asked me to talk about, the elected dictatorship, here I think there's a kind of leap to the particular which could be mistaken. Because when we talk about elected dictatorship, which we have, we're already running into talking about the voting system. And while that points to the question of democracy, democracy is about more than the voting system. It's about self-government, and this is where consent comes in, and our understanding that we are a self-governing society, even if the people that we have voted for haven't actually won an election. How that works involves rules. The processes by which you vote, who can vote, who can't vote, how are constituencies organized, all the things that Ben goes on about in his constitution. And the rules are a constitution. But what is a constitution? A constitution is much more than the rules about how the rules are made or unmade. It's also about all constitutions, about what kind of country we are. They're about what kind of nation are we. So democracy is connected, just like the hip bone is connected to the knee, to your thigh bone, to the knee bone. Just that our democracy is connected to our constitution, which is connected to the nation. But the nation is not something which exists on its own. This is where I would separate myself from the kind of classic Bennite Republican. Nations are connected to other nations. They're defined by other nations. And this is where I come from a tradition profoundly influenced by the arguments of Tom Nairn, who says that nationality politics is essential to any democratic or progressive politics. But nations have a story about themselves, as if they've come like a great tree from an acorn from within. But actually, the trees that are created as much are defined by the forest. Nations come about in contest with and in relationship to other nations. So and therefore, what kind of nation we are is about how we want to relate to other nations and to a world of nations. And this brings me to the heart of what you could rightly call the democratic crisis, which we have here, which is Brexit. The image that I think, to simplify what happened with Brexit, is this. And let me say something before I talk about this image. There's a lot of opposition to Brexit now, still, from Remainers, and I was obviously somebody who voted to remain in the European Union. Says it was all done due to lies, it was due to Russian money, it was due to cheating, it was due to kind of various forms of wickedness and Farage-like racism. Now, because the outcome was so close, it's completely true that without the illegal deployment of very large sums of money, certainly some of which came from Russian sources, and without the lies, and without that manipulation, the Brexit vote would not have won. But it's also true that it was won narrowly by those means because there was so much support for it in the first place. And the real origins of Brexit, the real causes of Brexit, was the power system which existed and ran the country from Major through to Blair, through to Brown, through to Cameron and Osborne. And it was that system which ran the country for 20, 30 years, which was responsible for people saying, we've had enough of you, we've had enough of this. So there's a deep way in which Brexit was not caused by the lies and manipulation. It was caused by the nature of the country for Brexit. And so the image that I have, which helps me to understand Brexit, is that of a supernova. Now, supernova is when a great star dies. It emits an enormous pulse of energy, which lights up the universe, and then it collapses into a black hole. And Brexit could be seen as a great pulse of democratic protest against the state of the United Kingdom, which certainly shocked Europe, but it shocked basically almost everybody. What is going on in Great Britain? And now we are being sucked into the negative, the dark gravity of a black hole. And this Brexit process of collapse is continuing and is sucking everybody into it, most notably Starmer and the Labour Party. Now, the reason that I emphasize the democratic impulse that initiated the collapse, the democratic explosion, which was people saying, very large numbers of voters saying, we've got a chance, a real chance for once, to say up yours to the elite, we're going to take it. But whatever it is, obviously the political establishment wants us not to vote this way. We've had enough, we're fed up to the back teeth. And that links, if you like, to the question of the collapse of consent. That the way in which people were being governed, they found intolerable, and they protested against it. The tragedy of Brexit is that far from being an emancipation, a true democratization, a return, if you like, to the kind of democracy people wish for, it intensified the rule by a careless and callous elite. It actually made the issue that it was a protest against worse. And we are now in a situation where we have to reverse Brexit. There is no way out of the democratic crisis for Britain, which does not involve a return to Europe. And one reason that I emphasize this is that Brexit itself is internally politically contradictory. So it's not just that it doesn't work economically. It's not just that the country is poorer. It's not just that we're all more insecure. It's not just that it is irrational to leave the market of our near neighbors. Something else was going on. And the best way of putting it is that if you're going to think about your own country, if you're going to take this story of democracy, the constitution of the nation, you need some kind of fundamental narrative which says to you what kind of country you are. And the Brexit elite, the Boris Johnson, Michael Gove, Cummings lot, had a story which they wanted to liberate Britain from the constraints of being in the European Union, so that it could become kind of Great Britain, could take its full place in the world. And to give an example of that, in the article that Johnson published in the Telegraph, which came out, where he came out in support of Brexit, he said, well, people tell us that we've got to have to, negotiate new trade deals with countries all around the world. How will we manage that? And then he literally says, well, we govern India with a much smaller civil service that we have at the moment. And if we could do that, we can negotiate trade deals. So this was the nostalgic consciousness that he appealed to. It's a kind of imperial, not colonial, but an imperial global, we are a world power, and we are now returning to that status. However, the largest number of the working class voters across the Midlands and the North that came out for Brexit. Let me pause a moment. Brexit wasn't a working class vote. It was a right-wing vote. The majority of the vote for Brexit was Conservative. And a lot of those Conservative voters, sort of golf club membership, the Daily Mail reading membership, especially across the south of England, were quite dyed-in-the-wool imperial sort of Johnsonites. But a very substantial part of what had been a Labour vote swung to Brexit as well. It was an alliance. It wasn't a majority of Labour voters, but it was a sufficiently large section of Labour voters to swing the outcome. And they voted, in my view, for the recreation of an Attlee Britain. And David Edgerton has written a very important book about the emergence of the British nation after 1945 around the Attlee settlement. And the Attlee settlement was both a welfare state, which they were voting for, and a warfare state. Far more money was being spent on the British Army. I mean, there were 800,000 people in the British Army by the end of or nearly 1 million. And you're making nuclear weapons. 3 nuclear bombers were under manufacture. It was you could see that the Labour government was utterly committed to keeping Britain as being a great power, and it was a paternalistic state, and which famously resisted joining the beginnings of the European Union, of those negotiations about coal and steel, a zone between Germany and France, and that. So there were 2 different stories going on in the Brexit vote. There was the story of let us return to a country which invested in itself, which was also, importantly, a modern welfare state, and one that invested in its own infrastructure and governed itself. And the other story, which was let us become a global imperial power free of all these kind of international regulations so that we can be buccaneering and make trade deals and be a great Britain in that global sense. Johnson, who was a great storyteller and understood the power of narrative in politics, told both stories and didn't believe either of them. And that gave him this apparently magical touch, but also meant that he was utterly incompetent as an administrator and as a prime minister. Now, in that kind of ghastly mess that has left us in, we have to think whether or not it's possible to rescue Britain, to go back to what Ben saw as, okay, he wanted to have an English parliament, which is very important, but he was still basically an anti-European British figure. He wanted to go to a kind of democratized version of 1945. And my view is, and I think that this is something which any Republican has to think through very carefully, that this is impossible. It was possible, I think, at the end of the last century, as the new Labour came in, when the Scottish and Welsh parliaments were being created, the Human Rights Act was being created, and aristocrats were almost entirely swept out of the House of Lords. It was possible at that point to create a new settlement which would have turned Britain into a multinational European country. And Blair set his face against that and decided that he had to back the United States. And the crucial moment of that was the Iraq War. After that, there was no return. And so my view is that there is no longer a British story which will take us back to the European Union. And that means that the way that we can reverse Brexit is to take hold of our separate national politics. In Scotland, where I've just been, we've just had a very successful conference called the Breakup of Britain. It's partly a salute to the late Tom Nairn, but Caroline Lucas is speaking, Clive Lewis is speaking, Richard Wynne-Jones and Leanne Woods from Wales are speaking there. Fintan O'Toole has done a very powerful video, which you can see. He was in America, so he couldn't join us. But if you like, as he put it, a voice from the archipelago, from the Irish part of the archipelago. And it was a kind of turning point because it was saying the route back to Europe is via our national politics. And that means that any progressive political framework trying to address the democratic crisis which we have here, in my view, has to be one which is willing to embrace full-heartedly a democratic national story of our separate nations. And in particular, I think in terms of this group, of pushing for an English outcome. We need an English democracy. And once you have an English parliament, once you start talking about an English parliament, any kind of constitutional democratic settlement must allow the other national parliaments to take their own course. You can't have a Bennite type constitution of Britain, which says, well, the Welsh can have a parliament, the Scottish can have a parliament, the English have a parliament, but they can't leave. It can't become a prison of nations, which is what the United Kingdom is at the moment. And once you've granted that, why should they stay if they are going to be part of the larger European Union? If you're in Scotland and you have a choice between being part of the British Union or the European Union, you're certainly going to choose 70, 80% would choose the European Union if that choice was presented to them as a clear choice tomorrow. And that's the choice that we also ought to take and ought to encourage. And so that leaves a final question, which we can perhaps raise in the discussion, which is, well, isn't Europe itself undemocratic? How do we address this issue of the nature of the absence or relative absence of democracy in the EU? And the way I see it, the EU is the terrain of reality in which nations, who are indeed the heart of what it means, the democratic processes, can negotiate with each other and contest in terms of their interests and work together and struggle with each other as nations do and as we do within nations. And I don't believe that the European Union is going to become a replacement of the nations of Europe. I know that this was the ideal behind it, but that doesn't mean it's the reality of what it has become. I think the European Union has saved the nations of Europe. And that's why Ukraine, for example, wishes to become part of the European Union in its struggle to articulate its independence. And that is the that is the crucial aspect of what we need to address. And there's one last thing I would say about that, which is very quite distinctive, and I think people still haven't got their heads around, which is the nature of regulation. And if you do, excuse me, I will end on this somewhat technical, but I think very important point in terms of how we experience life today. If you historically wanted to go and get wanted to buy a meal outside, you might go to a fish and chip shop. You might know the local person who was doing it. The fish and chips are wrapped up in newspapers. If the fish was bad, you could go around and punch the guy on the face, but it was his fish and chip shop or her fish and chip shop, and you paid cash. Today, if you want to get a takeaway meal, it's all too likely that you will order it with a credit card, that there will be a delivery person, that it will come from a chain, that the person who's made this food is completely unknown to you, that much of the food is supplied automatically. And it's a whole lot of things which then follow. What is the content? How healthy is it? How can you make sure that your bank details aren't stolen? How do you make sure that the person who is the delivery person isn't utterly exploited? And the answers to all those questions are regulations. What it goes into that, the food, has to be labeled, and toxic, there are, toxic contents, despite the water companies, is forbidden. The way in which your bank card details are managed across the internet is also regulated. We need that regulation. If you, like me, take modern medicine, statins, or whatever it might be, you want to know that those medicines are regulated, that there are criteria by which their quality is assured. And modern life is inconceivable without regulation. And our bodies now, what we are as people, what we wear, what we use, how we use them, how we buy, how we consume, all of this is taking place within a regulated environment. And people like regulation. But regulation was not a big issue in the Brexit debate, despite the fact that people running Brexit hate regulation, because regulation is relatively positive. It empowers us. It means that in this strange, difficult, modern, multinational world, we can be sure that what we're eating or what we're wearing or what we're using are what is said on the tin. And regulation, therefore, has become a new arm of government. Traditionally, going back to Montesquieu, it was seen as there were three legs for government. There was the legislature, there was the executive, and the judiciary. But regulation, it isn't. You can't have scientific medical regulation in your legislature. They're not qualified to do it. It's not up to the executive, famously, because the executive is even less qualified. And it is partly a judicial process, but it's a judicial process of a different kind. And those three branches of government are all interrelated. They don't exist separately. And regulation also is built into, but it's not merely below. It exists alongside and equal to those. And the European Union is a regulated space. If you want your beaches, if your children or grandchildren go on holiday to Spain or to Greece, you want those beaches to be clean. And because in the European Union, they are clean. And you want the transport system that they're working on to be relatively safe, and while going thousands of miles away from where we are. And the regulated space assures you to some degree that they are safe. So that is part of what we're about. It's part of what the European Union is about. It's part of what modern life is about. And it's therefore part of what democracy is about. There are then questions, big new questions. How do we democratize regulation? How do we bring in, given that we can do now with the internet, direct participation as an aspect of the democratization of both of the European Union and of our own government? Well, here, there's no discussion of this. Within the European Union, there are now big experiments in how can you bring citizens' assemblies to bear on the legislative process. So there are big new areas of democracy that we need to talk about. But above all here, in terms of the democratic crisis, we have to confront our national question. This is the start of how we move out of the crisis that surrounds us. We have to generate a new national narrative which takes us back to the European Union and does so with democratic flags flying. Thank you.